Wein und Genuss wird präsentiert von Flaschenpost, Albert Mathieu, Walliser Weine, Paphos-Weine und Zweifelweine.
Okay. My guest today is Joel Peterson from California. He is a gifted and experienced winemaker and the founder of the Ravenswood Winery in Sonoma Valley, California. One of his big dedications are wines of the grape Zinfandel. Hello, Joe. Welcome. Doesn't it feel like summer in San Francisco right now?
Absolutely. You know what Mark Twain said? He said the coldest summer he ever spent, or coldest winter he ever spent, was summer in San Francisco. So there you go. And it does feel a little like that, but we've just come off a wonderful harvest. It's been very cool this year, meaning that it stayed 85 degrees almost all year during the growing season, which is perfect for grapes. So we have a lovely group of wines that are now in the fermenter and going very nicely. Dark, spicy, delicious wines.
Okay, that leads right to the next question. Zinfandel is probably the only grape which is really closely connected to California. Zinfandel is probably the only grape variety really tied closely to California. California and Zinfandel, it seems it belongs together. You as a Zinfandel enthusiast and winemaker, how should a authentic, well-made Zinfandel taste like?
You're right about Zinfandel being very closely tied to California. It's a grape that found the environment for itself. The grape that found a place where it was dry enough during the summer and we had the right amount of rain to dry farm it. So really perfect. So a good tasting Zinfandel really is very expressive of its fruit. Most people say it has a combination of raspberries, black cherries, and blackberries as sort of its general fruit aromas. It tends to have kind of a vanilla character in behind it. And when it's well made, it's dry. It has a long finish, and it's very spicy. Spicy in the way wine writers talk about these things. They say it has baking spice character. And what they mean is things like cinnamon and nutmeg and maybe cardamom, those kinds of spices. Not exactly that, but you get the sense, basically. So it's pretty delicious. It sometimes can smell a little like Christmas.
Okay, back in the 70s, when you were starting your own winery, Ravenswood, you right away started with the grape variety Zinfandel. How come you started with that grape variety and not like others with grape varieties like, let's say, Cabernet?
Well, I actually had grown up drinking wine. My father taught me to taste when I was 10. And we had almost exclusively European wines, so it makes my choice even a little odder. But when I looked at California and I said, what grape do I want to make wine out of? I looked at the characters of the vineyards, like what was the common character that make great wines in Europe great? And there are a few things that they have in common. One of them is that they're dry farmed. Secondly is that the production levels are low in some kind of a balanced area. They have a trellising system that's open that lets a lot of light in. And they're planted in a place that is really specifically good for that grape. And in 1976, when I started my winery, the only grape in California that really fit that description was Zinfandel. It was planted a long time ago. In fact, the first grapevines were planted in 1854, replanted in the 1880s after the first phylloxera. But these grapevines are all goblet trained or head pruned or bush vines, depends on what nomenclature you're using. But they produce about 2 to 2.5 tons an acre. They're dry farmed, and they're actually in select places because during Prohibition we lost vines, but the ones that remained and survived were the very best. Those are the ones that people preserved, and they were in the best places. So I had an opportunity to make wine from grapes that had terrific potential that wasn't being realized, in part because everybody was focused on Cabernet and Chardonnay and things like that. So I got to use what was essentially California's indigenous grape, although it is a vinifera grape, to make really superior wine. And for me, that worked very well.
So you had a head start, actually, because of older wines already extinct.
That's exactly right.
So looking back, was it actually easier for you to start with Zinfandel?
I think it probably was easier to start with Zinfandel because it meant I wasn't competing. You had I started a 327 case winery with $4,000. This wasn't much. I mean, the standing joke is, how do you make a small fortune in the wine business? You start with a large one. Well, I started with that small, no fortune, and so I had to be in a place. I had to find a niche where I could do something really well that would make me stand out. And I couldn't compete with Robert Mondavi. I mean, after all, he was already pretty well entrenched in what he was doing, and he was doing Cabernet. So for me, Zinfandel was exactly the right grape.
And it worked out. You are very experienced and successful today. So, despite the relationship of Primitivo and Zinfandel, we know about the relationship Primitivo from South Italy. Zinfandel still is the grape variety of California. It didn't get spread out through other wine regions. It's a little bit grown in South Africa, a little bit in Western Australia, but not very well known. Why is that? How come that Zinfandel remains in California and doesn't grow somewhere else with success?
Well, I think in part because Zinfandel actually migrated from place to place. It had a long odyssey. It came from Croatia. It was a grape called Zerlinac Kastelanski, and probably pre-1800 it went to Italy and kind of got stuck in Apulia. But it went to Vienna, and then it went to New York, went to all places. It went to Queens, New York, where it first arrived there. Then it went to Boston, and it came to California in 1854. So this is a grape in search of a place. And the reason that it got to California and got planted was because it made a sensational wine in 1863 that everybody said, oh, this must be the great grape. So by 1880, there were 30,000 acres of Zinfandel planted in California. So there was a lot of grapevines planted there by then. But the reason that it made good wine there, and it didn't anyplace else, is because California has exactly the right climate for Zinfandel. The rains stop in June, the grapes begin to come out, and instead of getting warm and slightly humid, it gets warm and it stays dry. And Zinfandel's a very tight clustered, relatively thin-skinned grape that will rot if it gets rain during the summer. And almost every place that grows grapes has some kind of summer rain. Bordeaux does, for instance, Burgundy does, the island environments of New Zealand, even Australia. And so they're not as dry. They're not exactly right for Zinfandel. So what you do in California is you get these beautiful clusters that are perfectly ripe with a slightly uneven ripening character that Zinfandel has. Slightly raisiny and a couple, about 20% of the grapes, perfectly ripe, and then about another 10% slightly underripe. So you get the acidity, you get the ripeness, and you get the perfect fruit. And that is what California does really well for this grape. And it performs very well year in and year out.
You mainly export Zinfandel to Switzerland, I guess. And wine lovers in Switzerland love Primitivo. And they know Zinfandel, Primitivo are related. So when you started exporting to Switzerland, was that a help to you that Primitivo here was so much drunk, or was that competition for you a handicap?
I don't think people drinking wine is any handicap at all. What you learn about wine drinkers is that they love to experiment. They like diversity of flavor. They're generally interesting people, and they don't like the same old thing all the time. So. And I don't think that for a long time we knew Primitivo was Zinfandel. I mean, really, it was until recently when Carol Meredith did the genetic work, we really had no idea. And so it probably wasn't a hurt or harm or maybe even a help, except the fact that people like good wine and they liked wine with that kind of flavor profile, that spicy, berry, rich kind of character. And that's what Zinfandel is. So if there was any feed from Primitivo, it was just because it was a nice flavor profile that people recognized.
So it was a help, actually.
It was a help, yes.
Would you say Zinfandel is more of a seasonal wine? Having seasonal food on certain seasons. What would you recommend with Zinfandel?
I wouldn't say it was a seasonal wine. I would say that it was a year-round wine. It's a wine that you want to have anytime you want to have something rich and spicy and heartwarming. And it's a Mediterranean grape, and it actually holds those credentials very well. So it does well with a couple of things. It does exceedingly well with grilled meat. Things like lamb and beef and anything with that kind of smoky quality, that grilled character, is delicious with Zinfandel. But the other thing it does really well with are things that you would sort of associate with Mediterranean kind of flavors. Garlic, olive oil, tomato-based things, those kinds of things do very well with Zinfandel. So things with good herbal characters are very compatible with Zinfandel.
And a very nice deep dark chocolate cake.
Well, if you had the right Zinfandel, but you'd have to have one of the sweet ones. And I don't advocate sweet Zinfandel unless it's Zinfandel port. You've made it intentionally that way, and that's what you're shooting for. But I have to say, I like it with really good food, as it were, not so much dessert.
Wein und Genuss wird präsentiert von Flaschenpost, Albert Mathieu, Walliser Weine, Paphos-Weine und Zweifelweine.